Hello and welcome back to 7th Circle Gaming. Today on the channel we're going to be discussing the game Pathfinder Kingmaker. And let's get started as we always do here with full disclosure. Pause the video now and read through these at your leisure, or we'll move right along because we do have a couple of screenshots to show off. The first one is just a generic screenshot from early in the game that illustrates a couple of things. The user interface, in particular, look at the lower left-hand corner of the screen. There's a lot of buttons to click on. And then the middle of the screen. There are a couple of buttons that will become more important as players progress through the game. So, let's move on and let's talk about immersion. As we just saw, the game attempts to immerse players into its game world with an isometric perspective. The setting is what looks to be a fairly generic medieval-ish Dark Ages fantasy times that we're all familiar with from films like Lord of the Rings and others. The game also attempts to immerse players into its game world with agency. There are a fair amount of typical fantasy species to choose from: elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, that sort of thing. There are also a exhaustive list of classes and subclasses that are available from the start of the game, and subclassing is available very early in the game. There are also, for players who are not interested in all of that, there are pre-made characters available. The game also is offering to immerse players into its world with NPC interactions. And the game is going to use, in addition to all of that, statistics focus, because almost as we expect, every item in the game world, in every spell, every skill, every feat, has statistics attached to it. But from all of my time with the game, it doesn't seem like that really is what the game is really looking to immerse players into its world with. It's really the agency and the challenge. Because deciding the combat strategy and interacting with NPCs is where the game is really trying to immerse players into its game world. It presents players very early on in the game with difficult decisions that are going to shape how the rest of the game progresses. So if we didn't say it, the game has got an 11 out of 15 for immersion. Right now, though, let's move on because we do need to discuss difficulty. And what we're looking at now is the pre-campaign launch screen where players are going to select the difficulty options that they want. Again, pause the video if you want to take a closer look. Let's move on. And the game has earned a 10 out of 15 for difficulty. As we just saw, the options available are fairly comprehensive, exhaustive. Pick the adjective that you'd like to use. On the other hand, the explanations of how those are going to impact gameplay varies from very impressive to a fairly minimalist explanation. Players might find that they need to play through the game a fair ways to see how those options are going to impact their enjoyment of the game, because some of the options are not necessarily the most understandable just looking at the menus. For players that really are not interested in digging into all of that, the game does offer the course adjustments of easy, medium, hard, etc. to choose from. Now, we have said that the user interface does not overly impinge on difficulty, and that is going to be caveated with the notion that as players play through the game, they're going to get, they're going to come to understand more what those buttons do and how to interact with them. The game does have a really interesting, well done play as you go tutorial. So it really, again, it's geared toward that play as you learn as you go. And just load up the game and try it. For want of a better phrase, but though that does sound like a rather good one. Learn as you go. So where is that going to bring us? That's going to bring us around to Lasting Appeal. The game is earning an 8 out of 15 for Lasting Appeal. It does have a fair amount of downloadable content available. It's possible to play through the game as the best, most perfect person in the world. It's also possible to play through the game as the biggest jerk in the world. And that's going to keep players coming back to the game to see what different options do. It's possible to play through the game with all of the different classes, different species, and see how the NPCs interact and see what those spells do, because the spell effects in the game are particularly interesting, and the spells that are in the game are not necessarily the default spells that one might expect. Now, it's also fairly accurate to say that players don't seem to be likely to discover absolutely everything in one playthrough of the game. On the other hand, the early game does seem to drag a little bit. Yes, it does try to keep players interested with a fair amount of combat and some difficult decisions, but as players try the different classes, the different species, and the different decision points, they are going to find that the game does seem to get repetitive The game has already moved on, or the series has already moved on from Pathfinder Kingmaker to a standalone side grade sequel, so that's also something to keep in mind. And that's why the game is earned an 8 out of 15 for Lasting Appeal. It does present a lot of things to keep players coming back to it, but to necessarily choose this game over the sequel, that's going to be a decision that every player has to make for themselves. So, now that we've reached more or less the end of the video, let's talk about the final analysis. The game has earned an average score of 9.6 out of 15, which is very good. And just to explain that a little bit further, there are a wide array of character customization options, character creation options. There is also a fair amount of downloadable content available. It does seem like the downloadable content has sort of reached its natural end. There is a standalone follow-on game available already. In fact, it was just on sort of reduced price on Steam last week. Some players won't necessarily be accustomed to the in-game language. There's some examples there to look at. On the other hand, the game does seem to play fairly well with a keyboard and mouse or a gamepad. We did try both. On the other hand, some of the customization seems superfluous, and we're going to put on our subjectivity hats here for just a moment and say that while it is possible to play through the game as a male-bodied character or a female-bodied character, it does seem like the female-bodied characters got a little more attention paid to them. So While the male characters are available, they do seem to look a bit more generic than the female characters do. So take that for what it's worth, grains of salt and all that. And now let's put on our objectivity hats again, and we'll just say thank you very much for reaching the end of the video. Give yourself a pat on the back, and 10 gamer score for reaching the end of the video. Do the other YouTube things, comment below if you did play through the game. Leave a suggestion for another game that you'd really like to see me take a look at. And that's all I've got to say about Pathfinder Kingmaker. The next game that we're going to be looking at again is Grand Tactician Civil War 1861 through 1865, and goodbye.